Hello, everyone. Welcome back to The Dark Side. I'm your host, Sherry, and I'm so glad to have you here with me. Today, we're talking about an elderly couple who spends their winters in Florida at their home. Once spring comes around, they leave and travel back to their New York home for the summer. Then they go back to Florida for the winter and so on. It's a nice life, it seems. They've made this exact trip lots of times, but something happened on their way to New York and they are never seen again. There's a big possibility these two were targeted. Let's get into the story. My sources are in the description area. This is episode 134, The Case of Charles and Catherine Romer. In 2019, a group called Adventures with Purpose was founded. It consists of a group of 6 men who are an underwater sonar search and rescue dive team. Since 2019, they have located 33 missing people. They didn't start out as cold case solvers. They started out as a group who would remove cars from the water that had been in there a long time and were polluting the water. But in doing this, they located 2 sets of human remains. So they decided to make this their full-time gig. A typical case is they are given a background on a missing person. The missing person usually disappeared in their car and would have had to go over a bridge over some kind of body of water. This group has really high-tech gear and they go into the water and they search around with sonar equipment. I've watched videos where they locate the car and human remains. Some have been underwater a long time. They tow the car out of water and then they call the police to come take over. They have over 3 million subscribers on YouTube where they upload videos of their searches. I was shocked one day when one of the divers from Adventures with Purpose commented on one of my episodes. He told me how hard they looked for this individual and thanked me for covering the case. In 2023, they set off on another dive. This time they're in Brunswick, Georgia. They've got the camera guy, a boat, and all their dive equipment. They are looking for a custom 1979 black Lincoln Continental. This is a huge luxury car. It belonged to a married couple named Charles and Catherine Romer, who disappeared in 1980. They were last seen at a hotel in Brunswick, Georgia. Near this hotel was a body of water they possibly drove over. Could they have ran off the road and went into the water, and that is where they have been for the last 44 years? Did they park at a restaurant and the car may have rolled into the body of water nearby? Unfortunately, the team doesn't find what they are looking for. They found a small boat, a manatee, and some debris, but no Lincoln Continental. Where on earth can Charles and Catherine Romer be? We're going back to 1980 for this one. Ronald Reagan was elected president. Sandra Day O'Connor became the first woman on the U.S. Supreme Court. Pac-Man was released in arcades. Former Beatles member John Lennon was fatally shot. Mount St. Helens erupted. And in weird news from 1980, former President Jimmy Carter was on a solo fishing trip. He says he encountered an angry swamp rabbit frantically swimming towards his boat. He said the rabbit tried to climb on his boat and he had to splash it away with water to get it to go away. The press got a hold of the story and headlines read that Jimmy Carter was attacked by a killer swamp rabbit and he became the butt of many jokes. Charles and Catherine Romer are 77 and 73 years old at the time of our story in 1980. They are a retired couple enjoying their golden years. Charles was a retired Sinclair oil executive, making him a very rich man. He was born in Cincinnati, Ohio, but moved to New York, where he was raised the oldest of 4 children. He ended up staying in New York the rest of his life. Charles was married to a woman named Jane in 1929. They had 2 sons together. They bought a home in Florida and would often stay there for the winter and then return back to New York for the summer. Jane passed away in 1973. Soon after Jane's death, Charles reconnected with his friend Catherine, and the two fell in love and married in 1974, just 6 years before our story. Catherine, like Charles, had a spouse that passed away. Catherine had lived in Scarsdale, New York, and had worked as a stenographer. Her husband Frank was a very rich man. He was the chairman of several real estate firms. He was also the president of a carpet manufacturer in New York. The couple had one son. When her husband Frank passed away, he left Catherine a massive estate, and she was able to continue her luxurious lifestyle. According to writer Michelle Short, Charles and his first wife Jane and Catherine and her first husband Frank were all friends. They mingled in the same clubs and social circles before Jane passed away and Frank passed away. When Catherine married Charles, the two moved into her high-rise apartment in Scarsdale, New York. Charles owns a high-rise apartment in Miami, Florida, and just like he did with his first wife, he and Catherine would travel down there for the winter and come back to their New York apartment for the summer. At the time of our story, it's 1980. They've been married for around 6 years. They've taken this trip back and forth for 6 years now. Charles has been doing it for over 40 years. The only thing that made this trip different from the others was instead of driving to Florida from New York, they flew down and then they had their car delivered to them. But after a few months in Florida, they were making the trip back to New York for the spring and summer months. They always took the exact same route back to New York. That's a really long drive. It's approximately 20 and a half hours of driving, so naturally they're going to stop at hotels. They always took the same highways and stopped at the same hotels each time. They are self-proclaimed creatures of habit. Every year it's the same thing. On April 8, 1980, Charles and Catherine are en route from their Florida home back to their New York home. By the time they reach Brunswick, Georgia, they had been driving for about 7 hours. They had reservations at a couple hotels for this trip. This is before the days of the internet. It's 1980, so they had to have a travel agent call in their reservations, which they had done weeks ago. At 3:15 p.m., they arrive at the Holiday Inn in Brunswick, Georgia. Charles is exhausted from driving so many hours. These folks are in their 70s. Charles pulls his large Lincoln Continental into a parking spot, and they get out and stretch, and then they check into the hotel. I've read that there's been some question as to why they stayed at a Holiday Inn if they're so wealthy. I can confirm, as a child of the 80s, the Holiday Inn was much more glamorous than it is today. It was a luxurious place for travelers to stay. It had features like swimming pools and on-site restaurants, which were considered upscale for the average traveler of that time. This hotel stay is when the mystery begins. The last sighting of Charles and Catherine was when they were seen carrying their luggage into their hotel room. 2 days later, this is April 10th, 1980. The hotel maid knocks on the room's door. She doesn't get an answer, which is not surprising since Charles and Catherine's car isn't in the parking lot. The maid uses her master key to let herself in. She sees the room appears to be very neat. The bed looks like it hadn't even been slept in. There's a half a bottle of scotch with 2 glasses sitting on the dresser. All of their clothes and belongings were neatly folded or hung up. There's some potted plants that Catherine had brought from their Florida home to put into their New York home. The couple's tax forms were spread out on a table. Some find this bit of info to be strange. The only thing I can think of as to why their tax forms are out during their travel is because it's the beginning of April. April 15th is tax day. Charles and Catherine likely owed money and they were doing their taxes last minute. The maid doesn't think anything of it and cleans the room, but 2 days later she returns to the room and everything still looks exactly the same. The hotel staff says that Charles and Catherine never checked out. They were only going to stay 1 night, and now it's been 4 nights and they're nowhere to be found. The staff was a little annoyed, thinking they may have tried to skip out on their bill. But Charles and Catherine weren't going to do that. Money is the least of their concerns. The police are called and they go into the room and see everything just as described. They are told, this elderly couple checked in. We haven't seen them in days. They were only supposed to stay for 1 night. Their car is gone. It's possible they left in their car to go to dinner and something happened while they were out. Another thing that was out in the open in the room was Charles' journal. Charles was meticulous and kept a journal detailing each day of their lives. The last entry was from April 7th. That was the day before they left for the trip, so there's nothing in there that would help find them. There were some other things found in the room that left people scratching their heads. Catherine was known to wear a lot of jewelry. Her jewelry was found in their room by police. It's estimated at $500,000. That's equivalent to $1.9 million today in 2024. Only a few pieces were missing, which were the ones that Catherine is wearing on her. She's wearing around $50,000 to $80,000 worth of jewelry. Today, that's around $200,000. The only other things that aren't in the room are Charles's wallet, which is likely on him. Charles was known to carry around $500 in his wallet at all times. The Lincoln Continental is missing as well. They learned the last confirmed interaction with Charles and Catherine was at 4:16 p.m. on the day they checked into the hotel. Charles had called his house in New York and spoken to the housekeeper. He was letting her know that they were on their way home, we're going to stay at a hotel tonight and get back on the road tomorrow. He told her to make sure you have the glasses chilled for cocktail hour before we get home. Now it's days later. They were supposed to be home by now. The couple's sons are wondering where they are. Charles Jr. phoned the resort hotel in South Carolina, which would have been their next stop. That hotel says they had a reservation, but they never made it. So Charles Jr. calls the Holiday Inn in Brunswick, Georgia, and learns that the couple checked in and they hung out a bit and then they disappeared. Now Charles Jr. is in full-on panic mode. A huge search is going to take place with ATVs, helicopters, police, regular citizens, the couple's grown children. Everybody was looking for them. The good news, and I guess you could call it good news, is that their car is missing. This is an almost brand new black custom Lincoln Continental. It's this huge, flashy, expensive car. You can't miss it. But finding this car wasn't going to be as easy as they expected because no one can find it. I know I mentioned in the beginning about Adventures with Purpose combing the water near the hotel looking for this car in 2023, but that wasn't the only time this body of water was searched. Just days after their disappearance, a rescue diver named George Baker put on his diving gear and searched, but didn't find any trace of the couple. George continued for many years searching the waters looking for this car, but each time it was unsuccessful. The license plate attached to the car was a New York plate that said CRR-CBR, which is their initials, which is adorable. I don't know what a car would look like after being underwater for 45 years, but chances are if that license plate could still be read, it'll be easy to know it's their car with those initials on it. Charles and Catherine's home in Florida is searched along with their home in New York. It didn't provide any clues of their whereabouts. I'm not sure what they would have expected to find since this couple disappeared partway through their trip, but they ruled out anything happening before and after. For years, the couple's children searched and did their best to keep this case alive. They were declared officially deceased in 1985. Donald Flynn of the FBI said, quote, "This mysterious disappearance has been of concern to us because they are predictable, responsible people, and it all just doesn't make sense unless you assume there was some foul play." We know Charles and Catherine checked into their hotel after driving for several hours. They hung up clothes, spread their tax forms on a desk, poured scotch into 2 glasses, and then they got in their car and left. My best guess is that they decided to leave for an hour or two to grab dinner. They got in the car with intentions of dining somewhere and then returning to the hotel where they would spend the night and then get back on the road the next morning. What happened once they left that hotel? A police officer reported that the day they disappeared, around 5 p.m., he spotted a fancy black Lincoln Continental parked near a group of restaurants. Chances are they made it inside to one of those restaurants and ate dinner. It's been 45 years and not a single trace of the couple has ever been found, including that giant fancy car. Despite tireless efforts by their family, including their sons who spared no expense in hiring multiple private investigators, the mystery remained unsolved. Every lead, no matter how small, ended in a dead end. No evidence has surfaced to provide any info about their whereabouts. Their disappearance is shrouded in silence and uncertainty. This family not only lost their parents, but the lack of closure makes the grief much worse. To me, that would be the hardest part, not knowing what happened. Over the decades, different theories have emerged about what could have happened to them. Some speculate they may have fallen victim to foul play, while others believe they may have just had a tragic accident in a body of water somewhere. One theory that seemed outlandish, but at this point we may have to consider, was that Charles may have gotten the car stuck in reverse and the car entered a body of water near the restaurant. A few even wonder if they could have chosen to vanish voluntarily. The lack of answers leaves us with no choice but to fill in the blanks ourselves. With no clues to guide us, we are left to imagine scenarios that could explain their sudden disappearance. Each person may reach their own conclusion, but the truth remains out there somewhere. It's getting to that truth, which seems impossible after all these years. Finding that car may be the key to solving this case, but unfortunately it's never been found. It's really unlikely that Charles and Catherine voluntarily disappeared. They didn't have anything to run from. They had a really low-risk lifestyle. They were in their 70s. They weren't known to associate with bad people. They didn't know millions in gambling debt. They lived the retirement dream. Besides, if they were to voluntarily disappear, they're going to need money. None of their wealth was touched until they were declared legally dead years later when the family split it up or whatever they chose to do with it. It's odd that Catherine wouldn't take her $500,000 in jewelry if she was starting over somewhere. It wouldn't make sense for them to abandon their wealthy lifestyle and go on the run. I've only heard of one other case where that happened. It was way back in our episode 41, the case of Adam Hecht. He was this rich young guy from Beverly Hills who grew up in his parents' mansion. His dad was a Hollywood film producer. He disappeared in 1989, and the most common theory about his disappearance was that he left his wealthy lifestyle to go live with the homeless. He had befriended homeless people and even moved them into his apartment. Many people believe he is alive and well and living on the streets, and he chooses to do that. I really don't feel like Charles and Catherine faked their deaths and took off somewhere. That's the least likely theory, and I believe a majority of folks feel this way. Remember, Charles called his housekeeper in New York and told her to have the glasses ready for cocktail hour. To me, that just shows how nice of a life these two had. We know an officer spotted a black Lincoln Continental sitting in the parking lot with other cars at an area where restaurants are, but we don't know if that was really their car or not. It could have belonged to somebody else. Did they go to some seafood restaurant near a body of water and end up going off the road and into the water? We know they downed scotch before they left because there was a partially drank bottle of scotch and 2 glasses that had been used sitting in their hotel room. A drunk driving theory is definitely possible, but these bodies of water have been searched countless times and the car wasn't found. A Georgia highway officer also spotted a new black Lincoln Continental driving down I-95, but it was heading south towards Florida, which is the area they just came from. This was 1 hour after they checked into their hotel. Of course, Lincoln made more than one of these vehicles. It's possible it was somebody else. But this officer said this car stood out, and the only reason that he remembered it was because of the unique license plate with initials on it. The next theory is foul play. As the FBI detective said, this all just doesn't make sense unless you assume there was some foul play. Were they targeted? Someone spotted a wealthy couple in this flashy car and wearing expensive jewelry and decided to kill them and take their stuff, and then they parted out the car, and that's why no trace of it has ever been found. It's possible. Catherine was wearing over $50,000 worth of jewelry at the time, but she had $500,000 worth of jewelry in her hotel room that wasn't touched. That was the gold mine, and all of it was still there. Remember, the hotel room was in pristine condition. There was no sign of a struggle. The maid said it looked like they unpacked and left. The bed looked like no one had slept in it. I think they arrived, unpacked, and then they had plans to return to this hotel room within hours after grabbing dinner. I don't see Catherine leaving all this jewelry around knowing that housekeeping would be coming the next morning. Plus, they only reserved one night. Did someone rob them of Catherine's jewelry that she was wearing? Charles' wallet, which was known to have around $5,000 at all times, and they took their car? If they were victims of robbery, the robber may have thought they had enough with what was on them at the time and they didn't need to go back to the hotel room to get the rest. Or maybe they didn't figure they had this gold mine of jewelry back at their hotel room. If they met foul play, was it when they were leaving the restaurant they possibly went to? Did someone spot this elderly couple with New York license plates and decide to take advantage of them? Were they run off the road? Some believe that someone followed them all the way from Miami and waited for the right moment to attack. I think if someone went through all of this trouble, they would have certainly known about the jewelry in the hotel room, and that's what they would have been after, not Catherine's wedding ring with a 5-carat diamond. I feel like they would have went for the big stash. At the end of the day, there's still no evidence that they were even robbed. As well, this jewelry never surfaced anywhere through sales somewhere in the USA. A less popular theory is that the travel agent who booked these hotel rooms had set them up. The only reason for this theory is that Charles Jr. didn't know which travel agency they had used, and no one ever came forward to collect the commission for the bookings. Is it possible they didn't need the commission since they had all this other money now? Or they decided, you know what, this couple vanished and I'm not going to attempt to collect my commission. I don't want to take a single dollar from them. There's the theory that Charles and Catherine picked up a hitchhiker on the way to the hotel and he or she got out once they arrived at the hotel and then they were robbed once they had finished unpacking. Hitchhiking was much more popular back in the day. I don't see them as the type to pick up hitchhikers, but that doesn't mean that they didn't. It seems like the most popular theory is that Charles and Catherine went off the road and into a body of water. While these areas have been searched thoroughly countless times, this scenario still seems the most plausible explanation. Now, there was a tip that came through and it seemed legit, but it wouldn't come until 2004, 24 years after their disappearance. A woman claims her late husband was a delivery man who was working in Brunswick, Georgia back in 1980. She said that on the night of April 8th, 1980, her husband was run off the road. It was pitch black at night and a black Lincoln Continental ran him off the road. He took this info to police when he heard an elderly couple disappeared in that exact same car, but it was buried with the rest of the tips. This woman in 2004 provided proof that her husband was delivering in that area on the night of April 8th, 1980. I have no idea what kind of proof one could provide 24 years later. It had to have been a delivery receipt or a gas receipt, but she had it. If this guy was run off the road by Charles' car, it would mean either Charles was drunk driving or someone else had the car. George Baker, the guy who was a rescue diver and searched the water days after their disappearance and went back every couple years and searched more, he found around a dozen or so cars in the water, but he never found that black Lincoln Continental. He believes this 100% was a crime. I'd like to bring up something I came across earlier this year. It's not directly related to Charles and Catherine, but I found it intriguing and it made me think of their story and what might have happened in a similar situation. A woman named Sandra Lemire had gone to a restaurant in Kissimmee, Florida back in 2012. She went missing after leaving the restaurant, and she had been on a date with a man that she had just met online, so this screams foul play. For 12 years, no one could locate her or her minivan. 63 bodies of water were searched looking for this minivan. It was done by a private group called Sunshine State Sonar. God, that's a tongue twister. Sunshine State Sonar. They're like Adventures with Purpose. You know, they scour bodies of water using sonar equipment to locate crashed vehicles in the water. In December 2023, the dive group was given some new info about Sandra. They were given a general area of a tower where her last cell phone ping was. Don't ask me why it took 12 years, but now they have an area that they can focus on. They checked a retention pond right next to the highway exit for Disney World. Using sonar equipment, they located a minivan 14 feet deep into this retention pond. So they put on their diving gear and they go in. The license plate matched Sandra's and the minivan was pulled out of the water. They found remains inside that were confirmed to be Sandra. She had been in that pond for 12 years, sitting right next to the highway. Her wallet, her cell phone, everything was right there. Police determined that she was traveling down Highway 147 and possibly oversteered near the exit, and her car went down into the retention pond. It quickly became submerged and she drowned. The diver, Mike Sullivan, told WESH News that he always believed this was a case of foul play, but it turned out to be a very tragic accident instead. Such a sad story. Rest in peace to Sandra. It makes me wonder how many cars are missing and submerged underwater waiting to be found. I'm also reminded of a story from 2021. A drought in California had Governor Newsom declare a state of emergency. It made the water at Folsom Lake recede a lot, almost 50%. Folsom Lake is normally 250 foot deep. So when it starts to recede, all kinds of weird stuff is found. A sonar crew picked up something huge in 2021, something much bigger than a car. They found an entire airplane. The airplane crashed in 1965. 56 years ago it went missing. It was a small passenger plane, but there were 3 passengers and a pilot on it. No one knew what had happened to them for many years. One woman who said her husband died a few years ago had spent most of his life searching for that plane because his teenage brother was on it. She only wished he could have been there when the plane was finally located. He was 3 years old when his teenage brother went missing, and to know he's finally been found would have been a bittersweet moment. It's possible something similar happened to Charles and Catherine. Their car was never found. Neither was all the jewelry Catherine was wearing. Most importantly, they have never been found. Every January, Charles Jr. would go to the Scarsdale Police Department to meet with detectives and let them know that he's still alive, those are his words, and ask if anything had surfaced about his dad or if there's been any updates. Each time he was met with, "No, the case is still cold." Charles Jr. passed away in 2007 at the age of 76. He never knew what happened to his dad and stepmom. I think the only way we'll ever learn what happened to Charles and Catherine is if that car surfaces from underwater. If they were killed by another person and the car pieced out and sold for parts, we likely won't ever know what happened. But if that car surfaces and the remains are inside, we will know that they drove off of a bridge or ran off the road and into a body of water. The disappearance of people, whether they vanish without a trace or under weird circumstances, both of which happened to the Rommers, is one of the most mysterious phenomena in a human's experience. Missing person cases stir the imagination and provoke deep questions about human behavior. I have always been fascinated by these cases and wonder how people can just up and vanish without a trace. The not knowing, as I mentioned earlier, will cause you to speculate between hope and despair. Sometimes these cases really fascinate the public. Look at Amelia Earhart or Malaysia Flight 370. No matter what, the hope is to turn mystery into knowledge and provide closure for the families. I've never experienced a loved one that has gone missing. I can't imagine feeling so helpless. I feel like I would be one of those people that spends every second scanning crowds and looking at someone walking down the highway. I'm also sure families have done this, and it eventually becomes too much to continue every day. George Baker told the Brunswick News in 2004 that every year the Rommers' 7 granddaughters light a candle and say a prayer for their grandparents to be found. They certainly wouldn't be alive today in 2024. They would be over 120 years old. Currently, the oldest person in the U.S. is 114 years old. This is truly a mysterious case. I hope someday we learn just what happened to Charles and Catherine. They were living their best lives in their 70s and just wanted to get home. I wonder if they would have just left one day earlier, one day later, would they have made it home? Rest in peace to Charles and Catherine Romer. That's it for this week, and I'll see you all again soon. Take care, and much love to you all.